I sat in the back corner of the stuffy lawyer's office, watching my relatives lean forward like vultures as Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and began reading Grandma's will. The mahogany table reflected the late afternoon sun streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across faces I'd grown to recognize more for their greed than their grief. My cousins Sarah and Mark exchanged knowing glances as the lawyer announced the house would go to Uncle Robert, the family business to Aunt Patricia, and the antique jewelry collection to cousin Jennifer. Each inheritance was met with satisfied nods and barely concealed smirks. They'd already divided everything up in their minds weeks ago, probably before Grandma's body was even cold. When my name was finally called, the room fell silent. I straightened in my chair, expecting perhaps a small keepsake or maybe a few $100s. Instead, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably and announced that I was to inherit the garden shovel from the tool shed, along with all gardening implements therein. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds before cousin Sarah let out a snort that she quickly tried to disguise as a cough. Mark didn't even bother hiding his smirk. Uncle Robert shook his head with what looked like pity, while Aunt Patricia whispered something to Jennifer that made them both chuckle. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. Of all the things Grandma could have left me, why a shovel? We'd spent countless hours together in her garden, sure, but I'd always assumed she'd leave me something more meaningful. The lawyer continued reading minor bequests to various charities, but I barely heard him. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what felt like a cruel joke. As the meeting concluded and everyone filed out, still murmuring about their good fortune, I remained seated. Mr. Henderson approached me with a sympathetic expression, placing the shed key in my palm. "I'm sorry, son. Sometimes the deceased have their own reasons that we can't understand." 3 days later, I stood before Grandma's tool shed with the rusty key trembling in my hand. The small wooden structure looked even more weathered than I remembered, its green paint peeling in long strips that curled like dying leaves. Morning dew clung to spider webs stretched between the corners, and I could smell the earthy scent of old wood and forgotten summers. The key turned reluctantly, and the door creaked open on protesting hinges. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through a grimy window. Garden tools hung from nails driven into wooden walls decades ago, rakes with missing teeth, pruning shears dulled by years of use, coils of hose that had seen better days. But there, leaning against the far wall like it was waiting for me, stood the shovel. It wasn't much to look at. The metal blade was scarred and darkened with age, the wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands. This was the same shovel I'd watched Grandma use to plant her prize-winning roses, to dig holes for new fruit trees, to turn the soil in her vegetable garden every spring. It had been her constant companion in the garden, as much a part of her as her weathered hands or her knowing smile. I lifted it carefully, surprised by how light it felt in my grip. The wood was warm despite the cool morning air, and I could almost feel the echo of Grandma's touch in its smooth surface. For a moment, standing there in the dusty shed, with sunlight painting everything golden, I could hear her voice. "The best treasures aren't always the ones that glitter, honey." Maybe this wasn't such a cruel joke after all. Maybe Grandma knew exactly what she was doing. Back at my apartment, I set the shovel against the kitchen wall and stared at it while making coffee. The more I looked at it, the more I noticed details I'd missed in the shed. The handle wasn't just worn smooth. There were small imperfections, tiny variations in the wood grain that seemed almost intentional. As I sipped my coffee, I ran my fingers along the handle, feeling for the familiar grooves where Grandma's hands had gripped it thousands of times. About halfway down, my thumb caught on something unusual, a slight ridge in the wood that didn't match the natural grain. I set my mug down and examined the spot more closely. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were really looking, but there was definitely something different about this section of the handle. The wood seemed to have been cut and then carefully rejoined, the seam so expertly hidden that it looked like a natural variation in the grain. I traced the ridge with my fingernail, feeling how it formed an almost complete circle around the handle's circumference. My pulse quickened as I realized what I might be looking at. This wasn't just wear and tear, this was craftsmanship. Someone had deliberately modified this handle, creating what appeared to be a hidden compartment right in the middle of an ordinary garden tool. I grabbed a flashlight from my junk drawer and shone it on the handle, tilting it at different angles. The ridge became more pronounced under the focused light, revealing tiny tool marks that suggested careful, patient work. Whoever had done this had taken great care to make it invisible to casual observation. The question that burned in my mind was simple. Why would anyone go to such lengths to hide something in a garden shovel? And more importantly, what had they hidden? I spent the next hour gently probing the seam with various tools, a butter knife, a screwdriver, even a dental pick I found in my bathroom drawer. Nothing seemed to work, and I was growing frustrated when I remembered something Grandma used to say, "Patience, honey. The best things reveal themselves when they're ready." Taking a deep breath, I decided to approach this more systematically. I examined every inch of the handle, looking for any mechanism or trigger that might open the hidden compartment. Near the bottom of the handle, where it would naturally rest against the ground when the shovel was propped up, I found what I was looking for. A small section of wood, no bigger than a dime, moved slightly when I pressed it. It wasn't obvious. You'd have to know exactly where to push and apply just the right amount of pressure. When I pressed it while simultaneously twisting the upper section of the handle counterclockwise, I felt something give way with a soft click. The compartment opened like a puzzle box, revealing a hollow space inside the handle that was about 6 inches long and perfectly cylindrical. My hands shook as I tilted the shovel, and something small rolled out into my palm. It was a ring. Not just any ring, but a stunning piece of jewelry that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant sparkles. The band was clearly gold, and set in the center was a stone that looked suspiciously like a diamond. Even to my untrained eye, this was obviously valuable, probably worth more than everything my relatives had inherited combined. But as I examined it more closely, I realized this wasn't just expensive jewelry. Engraved on the inside of the band, in tiny script that I had to squint to read, were the words, "To my beloved Eleanor, 1943, forever yours, James." Eleanor was my grandmother's name. I sat on my couch for what felt like hours, turning the ring over and over in my hands. The diamond, if that's what it was easily 2 carats, and the gold had the warm, rich color that suggested it was the real thing. But more than its potential value, I was fascinated by the inscription and the date. 1943 was the year before my grandfather died in World War II. I'd grown up hearing stories about him from Grandma, though she always seemed to get a distant look in her eyes when his name came up. He'd been killed in Italy just months before my father was born. Grandma had never remarried, never even dated as far as anyone in the family knew. But who was James? I'd never heard that name in any of Grandma's stories. My grandfather's name was William. I'd seen his picture on her mantelpiece 100 times, read his name on the faded letters she kept in her bedroom drawer. So who had given my grandmother this ring, and why had she kept it hidden for over 50 years? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why hide it in the shovel handle? Why not keep it in a jewelry box like a normal person? And why leave it specifically to me, when she could have chosen any of her other grandchildren or even one of her own children? As the sun set outside my apartment window, I made a decision. I needed to know the truth about this ring, about James, and about the secret my grandmother had been keeping all these years. But I also knew that this discovery was bigger than just satisfying my curiosity. My relatives had dismissed me, treated me like I'd gotten nothing of value from Grandma's estate. They had no idea how wrong they were. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the local library. If I was going to uncover the truth about this ring, I needed to dig deep into family history, and the library had the best genealogy resources in town. Plus, I wasn't ready to share this discovery with anyone yet. Something told me I needed to understand the full story before deciding what to do with it. The librarian, Mrs. Watson, remembered me from high school research projects and was happy to help me navigate the genealogy databases. We started with what I knew: Eleanor Morrison, my grandmother's maiden name, born 1920, married William Thompson in 1942, widowed in 1944. What we found in the 1940 census records surprised me. Listed at the same boarding house where my grandmother lived before her marriage was a James Mitchell, age 22, occupation listed as jewelry apprentice. The pieces were starting to fit together. Further research revealed that James Mitchell had owned a small jewelry shop downtown from 1941 to 1943. City directory listings showed the shop's address, and I realized with a start that it was just 2 blocks from where my grandmother had worked as a seamstress before she married my grandfather. But here's where the story took a tragic turn. James Mitchell was killed in a factory accident in late 1943, just months after the date inscribed in the ring. The newspaper obituary was brief but heartbreaking. James Mitchell, 25, beloved son and skilled craftsman, died Tuesday in an industrial accident at Morrison Manufacturing. He is survived by his parents and numerous friends who will remember his generous spirit and artistic talent. As I sat in the library, surrounded by decades-old documents and faded photographs, I began to understand the weight of what my grandmother had been carrying all these years. This wasn't just a hidden piece of jewelry, it was a secret love story, a relationship that had been cut short by tragedy and hidden away for a lifetime. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered. The timeline was becoming clearer. Grandma had known James before she married Grandpa, possibly even been engaged to him. When James died in 1943, she was left with this beautiful ring and a broken heart. A few months later, she married my grandfather, perhaps as much for security and stability as for love, given the uncertain times of the war. I started to understand why she'd hidden the ring. In the 1940s, society had very different expectations for women. A widow who remarried carrying tokens from another relationship would have been scandalous. And even decades later, how could she explain to her children and grandchildren that there had been someone else, someone who might have been the love of her life? But why leave it to me specifically? I was the youngest of her grandchildren, barely out of college, certainly not the most responsible one in the family. Then I remembered something that made my chest tight with emotion. 2 years ago, when I'd gone through a bad breakup, I'd spent a weekend at Grandma's house, helping her in the garden and feeling sorry for myself. She'd listened patiently as I complained about love being unfair, about how nothing ever worked out the way you planned. "Sometimes, honey," she'd said, leaning on her shovel as we took a break from planting bulbs, "the most important thing isn't whether love lasts forever. It's whether you let it change you for the better, whether you keep your heart open even after it's been broken." At the time, I'd thought she was just giving standard grandmotherly advice. Now I realized she'd been speaking from deep personal experience. She'd loved and lost, kept a secret for decades, but somehow remained one of the most loving, open-hearted people I'd ever known. Maybe that's why she chose me to inherit the shovel and its hidden treasure. The ring sat on my kitchen table for 3 days while I wrestled with what to do next. I'd had it appraised discreetly. The jeweler confirmed it was worth at least $15,000, possibly more depending on the diamond's exact quality and the historical significance. That was more money than I'd ever seen at one time. But selling it felt wrong, like betraying the trust Grandma had placed in me by leaving this secret in my hands. At the same time, keeping it hidden seemed to diminish the love story it represented. James had created this ring for Eleanor, had poured his skill and his heart into crafting something beautiful for the woman he loved. Hiding it away forever felt like letting that love die a second time. I thought about my relatives, still gloating over their inheritances. Uncle Robert had already put Grandma's house on the market. Aunt Patricia was liquidating the family business. They saw dollar signs where I saw memories, and they'd made it clear they thought I'd gotten the short end of the stick. Part of me wanted to march into the next family gathering and slam the ring down on the table, watch their faces as they realized what they'd missed. But that would be petty, and more importantly, it would expose Grandma's secret to people who might not understand or respect it. Then I had another idea. What if I could find out more about James? What if his family was still around? The ring belonged to this story, to this love affair that had been cut tragically short. Maybe it was time to complete the circle, to honor both James's memory and Grandma's secret by doing something meaningful with this unexpected inheritance. I decided to dig deeper into James Mitchell's story. The search for James Mitchell's family led me down a rabbit hole of old phone books, obituaries, and social media searches. It took nearly a week of detective work, but eventually I found what I was looking for. A granddaughter named Lisa Mitchell Chen, who lived about 2 hours away in the next state. My hands shook as I dialed her number. How do you call a stranger and tell them you've discovered a ring that their grandfather made for another woman 75 years ago? How do you explain that your grandmother kept this secret her entire life? Lisa answered on the third ring, and her voice was warm and curious when I explained that I was researching local history and had found references to her grandfather's jewelry business. I didn't mention the ring, not yet. First, I needed to understand what kind of person I was dealing with. What Lisa told me made my heart ache. James had been the artistic one in the family, the dreamer who'd apprenticed with a master jeweler in the city before opening his own small shop. He'd been engaged to a local girl. Lisa didn't remember her name, but knew the relationship had been serious. When he died, his personal effects had been scattered among family members, and most of the details of his life had been lost over the generations. I've always wished I knew more about his work, Lisa said wistfully. Family legend says he was incredibly talented, that he created these beautiful, unique pieces. But we don't have any examples of his craftsmanship. Everything was sold or lost after he died. My throat was tight as I realized what this meant. This ring wasn't just a token of love. It might be the only surviving example of James Mitchell's artistic legacy. Lisa, I said carefully, what if I told you I might have something that belonged to your grandfather? We arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between our two cities. I'd spent the morning cleaning the ring, polishing it until it sparkled like it might have on the day James first presented it to Eleanor. I carried it in a small velvet box I'd bought specifically for this occasion. It seemed important that it be presented with dignity. Lisa was a woman in her 40s with James's eyes. I could see it immediately from the old photograph she'd brought along. She was nervous but excited, clutching a small folder of family documents and pictures. When I showed her the ring, she gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Look at the craftsmanship. Look at how the setting holds the stone. I've never seen anything like it." She examined the ring with reverent care, reading the inscription aloud. "To my beloved Eleanor, 1943, forever yours, James." When she looked up at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Eleanor," she said. "That was her name. I knew there had been someone special, but the family never talked about it much. After he died, it seemed too painful. I told her everything then, about Grandma, about finding the ring hidden in the shovel handle, about the research I'd done." Lisa listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions or sharing memories that her own grandmother had passed down. "Your grandmother kept this secret her entire life?" Lisa asked incredulously. "It seems that way. I think she loved him very much, but life took her in a different direction." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding. "What are you planning to do with it?" That was the question I'd been dreading, because I still wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "I have an idea," Lisa said, after we'd sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. "But I want to hear your thoughts first." I'd been wrestling with the same question since I'd found her contact information. The ring was legally mine. Grandma had left it to me, hidden but intentional. I could sell it, keep it, or give it away as I saw fit. But morally, the situation felt more complex. "I keep thinking about what Grandma would have wanted," I admitted. "She kept this secret for over 50 years, but she also made sure I would find it. That has to mean something." Lisa leaned forward, her eyes bright with an idea that was clearly forming as we spoke. "What if we could honor both of them? James and Eleanor, I mean. What if we could turn this discovery into something that celebrates their love story instead of hiding it?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a website for a local historical society. They have a section dedicated to preserving local love stories and family histories. People submit artifacts and documents, and they create these beautiful displays that help preserve the human stories behind historical objects. The idea was intriguing. Instead of keeping the ring hidden or selling it for money, we could donate it to be part of a larger story about love, loss, and the secret histories that families carry. It would honor James's craftsmanship, Eleanor's memory, and the love they'd shared, however briefly. "There's something else," Lisa continued. "My grandfather's tools and some of his business records are still in my family. If we combined everything, the ring, his tools, maybe some of your grandmother's photographs and garden journals, we could create a complete exhibit about their lives and their time period." As she spoke, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that I recognized as the feeling of making the right decision. This wasn't about money or family politics or who got the better inheritance. This was about love and memory, and making sure that beautiful stories don't disappear just because they're complicated. Over the next month, Lisa and I worked together to piece together the full story of James and Eleanor's relationship. It was like archaeological work, digging through layers of family history to uncover the truth that had been buried for decades. Lisa's family contributed James's jewelry tools, some sketches he'd made of ring designs, and even a few letters he'd written to his parents about a special girl he'd met. From my side, I brought Grandma's garden journals, which I'd never read carefully before. Hidden among notes about planting schedules and weather patterns were occasional mentions of Jay and cryptic references to what might have been. The most revealing discovery came from a shoebox I found in my parents' attic. Photographs that Grandma had apparently given to my father years ago, but which he'd never bothered to sort through. Among pictures of family gatherings and holiday celebrations, we found a single photograph of Grandma as a young woman, standing outside a small shop with a sign that read, "Mitchell Jewelry, Custom Work." She was wearing the ring. The photograph was dated on the back in Grandma's handwriting, "Summer 1943, happiest days," just a few months before James died, before everything changed. Looking at that photograph, seeing the joy on young Eleanor's face as she stood outside her beloved shop, I finally understood the full weight of what she'd carried all those years. This hadn't been a casual romance or a simple case of first love. These two people had been planning a life together, and fate had torn it apart. The Historical Society was fascinated by our story and eager to create an exhibit. They helped us research the broader context, the home front during World War II, the role of small businesses in local communities, the ways that personal relationships were affected by the uncertainty of wartime. What emerged was a rich, complex portrait of two young people in love during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The exhibition opened on a crisp Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after Grandma's funeral. Lisa and I had worked with the Historical Society to create a beautiful display that told the story of James and Eleanor's love affair, but also the broader story of their generation. Young people coming of age during the Depression and World War II, building lives and relationships in the shadow of enormous uncertainty. The centerpiece was the ring, displayed in a custom case with special lighting that made the diamond sparkle like captured starlight. Around it were James's tools, his sketches, some of his business correspondence, and photographs of his shop. On Eleanor's side, we'd included her garden journals, photographs from her life, and a recreation of her garden tool shed, complete with the shovel that had hidden the secret for so long. But the most moving part of the exhibit was the story itself, told through carefully researched text panels that explained not just what had happened, but what it meant. The love story, the tragedy, the lifetime of secrets, and the ultimate decision to share the truth. Visitors could read about the social pressures that led Eleanor to hide her relationship with James, the ways that personal grief intersected with national trauma, and the question of how we honor love that doesn't fit conventional narratives. My family came to the opening, of course. They were polite, even impressed, though I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they calculated what the ring might have been worth. Uncle Robert made a comment about family treasures belonging in the family, but Aunt Patricia shushed him. The moment that made everything worthwhile came when an elderly woman approached me near the end of the day. She was probably in her 80s, walking with a cane, but moving with purpose. "I knew them both," she said simply. "Eleanor and James. I worked at the dress shop next to his jewelry store." My heart stopped. The woman's name was Margaret, and she was one of the last surviving people who had actually known James and Eleanor during their courtship. What she told me filled in the final pieces of a puzzle I'd been working on for months. "They were so in love," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "James would come into our shop sometimes, asking Eleanor's opinion on designs he was working on. She had wonderful taste, you know. She helped him with several pieces for other customers. And that ring," she gestured toward the display case. "He worked on it for months, trying to get every detail perfect." Margaret confirmed what I'd suspected. James and Eleanor had been engaged, planning a wedding for the spring of 1944. When he died in the factory accident, Eleanor had been devastated. She'd kept the ring, but couldn't bear to wear it publicly. "When she married William a few months later," Margaret continued, "it wasn't because she didn't love James anymore. She was pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant. That changed everything. Explained the quick marriage, the secrecy, the lifetime of carrying this secret. "Your father," Margaret said gently, "was James's son." I stood there in the middle of the exhibition, surrounded by the artifacts of a love story I'd thought I understood, and realized that I'd uncovered something much bigger than a hidden engagement ring. I'd discovered that my entire family history was different from what we'd believed. James Mitchell wasn't just my grandmother's lost love. He was my grandfather. The man in the photograph on Grandma's mantelpiece, William Thompson, had been kind enough to marry a pregnant woman and raise another man's child as his own, giving my father his name and his love without reservation. That night, I called Lisa and told her what Margaret had revealed. After a long silence, she said, "That makes us cousins, doesn't it?" "I guess it does." "I'm glad," she said simply. "I've always wanted more family." As I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. I'd started with what seemed like the least valuable inheritance imaginable, an old garden shovel. But hidden within that humble tool had been the key to understanding my entire family history. My relatives had fought over houses and businesses and bank accounts, but Grandma had given me something far more precious: the truth about who I am, where I come from, and the complex, beautiful, heartbreaking stories that connect us all. The exhibition was a success, drawing visitors from across the region who came to learn about James and Eleanor's story. But for me, the real treasure wasn't the ring or the recognition, or even the family connections I'd discovered. It was the reminder that love stories don't always have happy endings, but they always have meaning, that secrets kept out of love are different from secrets kept out of shame, and that sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as worthless old tools covered in dirt and years of patient use. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It's been an incredible journey to share James and Eleanor's love story with you, and I hope it reminds you that every family has hidden treasures waiting to be discovered, not just valuable objects, but the precious stories of the people who came before us. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and if you've ever discovered any family secrets or hidden treasures of your own. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more tales of unexpected discoveries and family mysteries. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue sharing these amazing stories with the world. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best treasures are hiding in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone with patience and love to find them.